As mentioned in my love/hate video for the XC90 recently, link in the top right hand corner, the parking brake is a big issue on this Mk1 XC90. A lot of people basically say it doesn't work, or they don't use it because it doesn't work, and it's seen as kind of one of the things you should probably expect to find a problem with if you go to buy one of these. So mine wasn't particularly terrible when I got it. It wasn't amazing, but I did notice over the period of a recent year or so it has started to get a bit worse. So beforehand it was like this. So it was about, I don't know, 7 to 10 clicks on that before it actually works, and it did hold. It held on an incline, but it wasn't great, and I was getting symptoms ever since I bought it, really, of like a ringing noise coming from the rear of the car, especially after I'd had the handbrake on, released it, and the car was nice and warm. So recently I decided to have a look at that, and I found what looked to be the shoes kind of disintegrating or coming loose inside the hub itself, which I think was causing a ringing noise. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity to refresh everything. I hadn't looked inside, I say the drum, it's the inner bell housing of the disc really, but I hadn't looked inside that the whole time I had the car. Didn't know what to expect, and it's not unusual for aftermarket brake shoes to cause this issue as well. It tends to only really work perfectly with the OE Volvo branded shoes. So I thought I'd take it apart and have a look. First things first, crack the nuts loose on the rear wheel. I hadn't taken it off before, needed to make sure I could before I even started, and then I moved on to the axle stands. I used two, one under the rear subframe and one on the sill, but the one on the sill I used a rubber puck on there. Spoiler alert, things got seized, so when you've got things seized on there and you have to start wrestling with them, the last thing you want is for a whole XC90 to land on your leg or something. So be safe, be cautious, and use axle stands. Make sure they're sturdy and in the right position. So once the wheel was loose, I could pop it off. It did need a bit of persuasion on here. It was a bit stuck to the hub. You can probably see on the hub itself there's a little bit of corrosion. But yeah, this is pretty much what you should be greeted with. The rear discs, they are for the main foot brake, the usual brake, they are caliper and pads, but the handbrake shoes sit inside the central housing of the disc there, and that's what we're going to be able to get to. And then with everything off, this is what I heard, and that's very much the sound of the shoes inside, obviously loose or falling away. So I needed to take everything off and investigate what that was. First things first, you should have a little 10mm nut on the central housing of the disc as well, just holding the disc onto the hub. So you have to pop that off carefully. Hopefully it'll be there and comes off in one go. Now usually I would say to get a brake caliper key like this, it's a hex key for undoing the caliper bolts, but unfortunately on the XC90 there's not really a lot of room for that kind of tool on there, and I didn't have anything stubbier to use. As you can see in this photo, the caliper bolts in a kind of like middle right side of the photo there's not a lot of room between them and the spring, but the actual caliper carrier bolts, you see a sockets on the lower one there. I was able to undo those with plenty of room, and that's the technique that I went for on this one. The next quick bit was to undo the bleed nipple on that caliper, just so I could get the pads to free off just enough for me to slide everything out of the way. And the caliper and the caliper bracket do come away quite easily with this, so it's perfectly possible to do. Once the caliper was actually out the way and I could get towards the point where the disc should have come off, everything was a bit stuck, so I used my magical tool, as you can see here. Nice rubber lump hammer, nothing too destructive because I didn't want to damage the disc, and what followed then was some tactical tapping, I would say, and the actual inner face of the hub had gone a little bit stuck, so I did put some penetrating fluid on there overnight, not WD-40, proper penetrating anti-seize fluid, and then the next day it was just a case of getting a swift tap in the right place to actually pop the disc off. And I knew that was the issue because when I was pulling the disc it just didn't move at all. If it pulls forwards a bit and you find that like the shoes are grabbing on there, you may need to skip towards a bit the end and loosen the shoes off so you can get them off, but for me it was just seized to the hub. when things do tend to seize up like this, it's never really an awful lot. You can see on the interface there, just in the middle, it's about a 10mm ring that was seized on. So it's not a lot, but it was holding on for dear life. But there's no lip inside the disc, so it's perfectly serviceable, so it's good to save it. And this is what I was greeted with once I got the disc off. That little cutout on the shoe there, that's where a spring should sit to hold everything in place, and that was missing. So essentially the whole shoe assembly was just hanging down off the hub in the centre, and that's likely what was causing the noise, with the inner face of the disc sort of like squeaking away on the dangling shoes. It's also no wonder why there was no actual braking force from the parking brake on that side. And there's a spring on the floor down there, as you can see here. It's all just loose and flopping around. So next up was just to remove the existing shoes on there. As you see on the right hand side, there's like a solid bar for separating them. There's a spring on there. So first of all, just to unhook that spring, and then everything just kind of like levers off quite easily, especially with none of the pre-existing springs on there. If you do have the springs on there, then it's the reversal of how we'll fit them in a minute. But this is essentially what you should be left with. You see on the left hand side there, there's the actual pivot point for when the parking brake's being applied. I gave it all a quick clean up. Didn't do too much on there, to be honest, but cleaned it up enough to stop everything kind of dragging or catching. And then just for reference, these are the bits that I took off. So the little broken springs you can probably see there in pieces. A spring on the left, the spacer on the right, and a spring on the right as well. And that's kind of how all of that fits together as a unit. For the new parts, I got some replacement springs, so it's part of a fitting kit. You see the part numbers on there, and a adjustable spacer instead, which we'll come to when we're fitting. I'll explain that. And I used genuine shoes, as you can see in the picture there. And I cross-referenced these once I'd taken everything off by double-checking the part numbers on the shoes themselves. The kit has a different part number to the actual shoe, but once I take the shoes out of the kit, you can compare and make sure you're fitting the same ones on there. I guess I was a bit lucky that the ones that were coming off were genuine ones. That's probably why the handbrake worked quite well before at one point. The springs snapping being the weakest link, not the actual shoes themselves. This is just a comparison of what's come off and what we're going to fit. On the left, obviously genuine shoes with some rusty old springs. On the right, some new springs, genuine shoes again, and the little adjuster kit which we're going to use, which is the right hand side, to replace that straight bar. That's going to help us to get the handbrake working a bit more effectively and fine tune it without adjusting the cable itself too much. And there's of course not in the picture there the little retaining springs that were missing or broken when we took it off, and they're going to hold the shoes onto the backing plate. Unfortunately, I don't have the equipment to have shown you video of me fitting this, but the technique generally is to get the left hand side on first, where this is on the driver's side at least, on the rear right of the car, and the spring on that side, so you can get it sitting on the little stop plate, and then get the handbrake lever mechanism on, and then move on to the other side after that. And that's going to be with the new adjuster wound all the way in, which makes it a little bit easier because it's a bit shorter. But as you'll see in the picture there, the spring kind of gets in the way of a little bit. It's not a massive issue, it just makes it a bit harder to get everything across. So I fitted everything together and then stretched with some long nose pliers the spring into place onto the bottom hole to get everything all nice and fitted back together. And these are the nice new little backing plate springs. They're not like some of the ones I've used before where you have like a top hat that fits on there. These ones, they kind of go in and you twist them to the side. So you might be able to see here the spring goes through, and the little leg goes to the left hand side of the backing plate and hooks around into there. So that's exactly how you want to get them in there. It's a little bit tricky, but you can get the hang of it quite easily, and just make sure that they're gripping on. As you can see in there, the position of the spring as you're looking at can give you an idea as to which way that little hook is going to point. So you'll see here when the spring kind of turns down into the 6 o'clock position, then the hook should be in a 9 o'clock position, and that's certainly how they were on mine anyway. So I could use that as a measure to know for the bits where I couldn't see where exactly it was hooking onto the back plate. So once everything's back on, you can slide the disc back over, and you ideally should be able to get in. See a sort of like a sort of 2:15, 2:30 position on the disc. You should be able to feel the little adjuster, and then kind of back it out up until the point where the disc isn't so sort of sticking onto the shoes. Just get it fine tuned to that level where it's just about free. Once you're happy, just stick everything back together as you had it, make sure it's all nicely torqued up and that 10mm bolt's back on the disc. And then you want to move on to the inside of the vehicle. On the passenger side or the left hand side as you're sitting in the car, you're going to want to pop off the panel that's just the bottom of the centre console, the first carpeted bit where it meets the plastic, and it is just literally a pull and pop it off position. As you can see here, there's like little spring loaded clips that keep it in place. And what you're going to be looking for now is the handbrake adjuster mechanism, and you'll see it here. It's a bit different to what I've seen on other things again. Little sort of tubular cylinder with the cable coming in and out of it. They should have a circlip on the right hand end of it, which mine again didn't have, but if it is there you might need to pop that off first, and then wind it in all the way up until it's hitting its furthest point. So I think that's counterclockwise on this, up until it's its furthest point to the right, basically. And it is a weird mechanism, so I don't want to go into how exactly it works or why, but you need to get like some pliers or something, for example, and put it on the left hand side and then push the cylinder to the right as much as you can, and this is going to essentially free off all the slack. Is going to push the adjustment to its loosest setting. And apologies for this because I was trying to film this and do it at the same time, but I use those pliers as basis to get a flathead in there and then just try and lever that cylinder out to the right. It's kind of like springy of sorts, but yeah, so I don't really know how to describe it, but you just need to keep pushing it to the point where it's at its furthest. And I was able to use a spanner as well to sort of then pivot against the pliers just to make sure it was its furthest. That's the point where you'd normally put the circlip back on the right hand side. I can then test the foot brake again. As you can hear there, the parking brake's coming on with about 3 clicks now instead of the 7 to 10. So car's still jacked up at this point, so I could go and just double check with the wheel back on. And ignoring the squeaks going on there, but that's locking from one side to the other. Perfectly normal in my experience on handbrake shoes to get that little bit of drift in there. That's like the mechanism just having a bit of slack in it, but it's like nice and locked up. No more grouching, grinding noises like before, and essentially what we've kind of done there is rely on that little adjuster to take up the slack instead of the cable. So the cable's got lots of adjustment in it now if it needs to use it. And yeah, the other side's exactly the same really, just mirror image. You can repeat it just the same. You don't need to mess around with the handbrake cable adjustment because of using that adjuster mechanism instead. And if you do get anywhere with time with using the handbrake, then so you can just use that hole in the disc to adjust the shoes if you need to. And that's about it really. I mean, this is 2021. The approximate cost of this, doing it myself from driveway, it was about £50. Genuine shoes, about £30 I think they were for those. There's not a huge saving in getting aftermarket ones, and some people will say the Mintex ones work just as well, but it's not a great enough saving to be worth the risk. You know, you're probably talking it's about £10 variance between like cheap aftermarket ones and genuine ones, and sometimes even like Euro car parts, the cheap kind of rubbish ones are going to cost you more than genuine, so always check that first. The adjuster mechanism, the springs, and it was about £20 for all those put together, so it's not an expensive thing. And generally speaking, as they say with these parking shoes, it's a use it or lose it situation, so it's good once you've got this all working again to just use that handbrake, foot brake, parking brake, whatever you want to call it, instead of just relying on park if you have the automatic, and it should keep itself well maintained and stop it rusting up. And yeah, that's about it. There's a few other videos on little bits and pieces like this if you want to check them out. I'll try and add some more as I'm going along. I've got a few more bits and pieces to do, so subscribe if you want to see those. If you need any help or if there's anything you want to ask, just do that in the comments below.